It was the dead of night on August 10th, 2019, in the bowels of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a federal fortress in Lower Manhattan that reeked of desperation and faded authority. There, Jeffrey Epstein, the financier entangled in webs of power and perversion, met his end in a stark cell, his death officially ruled a suicide by hanging. The air in those halls hung heavy with the metallic tang of rusting bars and the muffled echoes of distant shouts, a place where the weight of incarceration pressed down like an unyielding fog, especially in the summer heat that turned every breath into a labored sigh. Yet this conclusion, delivered with the cold precision of autopsy reports and official stamps, left a void that suspicion rushed to fill, whispering of darker possibilities amid a cascade of institutional lapses that seemed too perfectly aligned for mere coincidence. Epstein had been arrested just over a month earlier, on July 6, 2019, slapped with federal charges of sex trafficking that peeled back layers of his shadowy empire. The cuffs clicked shut at Teterboro Airport, where private jets once ferried him to islands of indulgence, now grounding him in the grim reality of MCC's special housing unit. The jail itself was a relic of bureaucracy, its corridors dim and labyrinthine, buzzing with the low hum of fluorescent lights that flickered like hesitant witnesses, while guards, stretched thin by chronic shortages, shuffled through shifts extended by mandatory overtime that blurred the lines between vigilance and exhaustion. In such a strained environment, where every overlooked detail could unravel lives, Epstein's isolation became a glaring oversight. His cellmate transferred out without a replacement, leaving him alone in the silence that amplified every creak and shadow. Then there was the DVR recording failure, a technical glitch that struck on July 29, 2019, crippling roughly half the jail's cameras and erasing potential footage that might have captured the truth of that fateful night. The system, meant to be an unblinking eye, went dark just as scrutiny intensified. Imagine the control room, screens flickering erratically amid stacks of outdated equipment and the faint scent of overheated circuits. A hub of supposed oversight reduced to blind spots in an era when surveillance promised omniscience. This blackout not only robbed investigators of visual evidence, but also seeded doubts that burrowed deep into the public's mind, suggesting a veil drawn deliberately over events too explosive to expose. Compounding the mystery, staff logs were falsified, entries penned to claim checks that never occurred, while the actual rounds lagged far behind protocol in a facility where paperwork often substituted for presence. The guards' quarters echoed with the rustle of hurried notes and the drone of radios, a backdrop of systemic neglect, where overwork bred shortcuts and the humid air carried the weight of unspoken resentments. Such fabrications eroded trust in the very system tasked with safeguarding high-profile inmates, implying a negligence that bordered on complicity, turning routine records into relics of deceit. The Office of Inspector General's investigation, released in June 2023, laid bare these failures. Chronic staffing shortages, mandatory overtime that frayed nerves and focus, and a litany of procedural violations, yet it staunchly upheld the FBI's suicide determination, finding no evidence to contradict it. In the sterile offices where reports were compiled, amid the clatter of keyboards and the sharp scent of printer ink, bureaucrats sifted through evidence under the harsh glow of institutional lighting, piecing together a narrative that satisfied protocols but not the curious. Nevertheless, this affirmation clashed with the mountain of anomalies, fueling a suspicion that the official story was a fragile dam, holding back a flood of unanswered questions. It is this chain of improbabilities, the vanished footage, the phantom checks, the solitary confinement that twists the blade of doubt, rendering the suicide ruling not just questionable, but a puzzle piece forced into a frame it doesn't quite fit. Epstein's death unleashed a torrent of documents and probes, each revelation stoking the fires of conspiracy in a digital age, where every shadow hides a theory, and the elite connections he boasted seem to linger like ghosts in the machinery of justice. The media frenzy outside MCC's walls brought throngs of reporters, their notepads flapping in the wind like flags of inquiry, while inside, the silence of empty cells spoke volumes about a system in disarray. These disclosures amplified the central enigma. How could a man whose secrets threatened the powerful slip away in a blaze of incompetence, leaving the world to wonder if suicide was the full story, or merely the beginning of a deeper deception? As we delve further, the threads of Epstein's life before that cell, his ascent through gilded circles, and the controversial plea that spared him once will illuminate the stakes that made his custody a tinderbox of intrigue. But for now, the question hangs in the air like smoke from a concealed fire. How did Jeffrey Epstein really die in federal custody amid a symphony of failures that played out in the dead of night? In the shadowed corridors of high finance and hidden desires, where the elite mingle in whispers and deals are sealed with a nod, Jeffrey Epstein carved out his empire. A world built on secrecy, privilege, and the kind of power that bends justice to its will. Born on January 20th, 1953, in the gritty sprawl of Brooklyn, New York, Epstein emerged from modest beginnings, the air thick with the salt of Coney Island and the hum of working-class ambition, only to ascend into realms where money flowed like shadowed rivers, unchecked and unseen. This rise wasn't just luck, it hinted at a cunning that would later shield him from the full weight of his sins, allowing patterns of exploitation to fester in the underbelly of luxury. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier whose opaque money management business and private island lifestyle masked a decades-long pattern of sexual exploitation and trafficking of underage girls. The kind of operation that thrived in the dim glow of private jets and secluded estates, where the scent of ocean breeze mixed with a metallic tang of untold fortunes. In an era of Wall Street excess, the 1980s and 90s, when champagne popped like gunfire and deals were inked in smoke-filled rooms, Epstein positioned himself as a shadowy advisor to billionaires, his methods as elusive as the funds he purportedly managed. Yet this facade concealed a darker truth, one that implicated not just Epstein, but a network of powerful figures whose silence perpetuated the cycle of abuse, eroding the very foundations of accountability. His little St. James Island, that infamous speck in the Caribbean, wasn't merely a retreat. It was a fortress of indulgence, surrounded by turquoise waters that lapped at shores hiding secrets buried deeper than the coral reefs below. Amid the rustle of palm fronds and the distant crash of waves, young girls were drawn into a web of manipulation, their youths traded like commodities in a market invisible to the outside world. The implication ran deep. Such isolation didn't just enable crimes. It fostered an ecosystem where influence could rewrite narratives, leaving victims voiceless in the echo of power's indifference. But the cracks in this veneer began to show earlier, in the humid haze of Florida's courtrooms back in 2008, where on July 25th, Epstein pleaded guilty to procuring an underage girl for prostitution and served a mere 13 months in a county jail under a controversial non-prosecution agreement. Picture the scene without the gloss: palm trees swaying under a relentless sun, the air heavy with the scent of salt and sweat, as lawyers in crisp suits negotiated deals in air-conditioned offices. Far from the gritty reality of the abuses they downplayed. This plea wasn't justice. It was a sleight of hand, a bargain that spared Epstein real consequences, while burying the stories of countless others, ensuring his web of connections remained intact and his secrets safe. The non-prosecution agreement, inked with the subtlety of a backroom handshake, extended immunity to potential co-conspirators, a move that reeked of favoritism in an age when the powerful already bent the rules like cheap wire. Courtrooms buzzed with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of papers, but outside, the world moved on, oblivious to how this leniency sowed the seeds for future reckonings. Here lies the rot at the core. A system that shielded not just Epstein, but his elite circle, perpetuating a cycle where privilege eclipsed punishment, and the vulnerable paid the price in silenced suffering. Epstein's work release privileges during that so-called sentence turned jail time into a farce, allowing him to roam free for hours, the iron bars more symbolic than restrictive in the sticky Florida heat. As deputies looked the other way and clocks ticked indifferently, this arrangement whispered of deeper corruptions, where money greased palms and justice became a commodity. The deeper meaning? It exposed a fracture in the facade of equality before the law, one that would haunt the narrative leading to his 2019 downfall. And yet, even after this brush with accountability, Epstein's life resumed its gilded path, his Manhattan townhouse echoing with the footsteps of the influential, the air perfumed with cigars and cologne masking the undercurrent of exploitation. In the bustling streets of New York, amid the honk of taxis and the flash of neon, his connections to politicians, scientists, and moguls flourished, unchecked by the scandals that should have ended him. This persistence underscored a chilling reality. Power doesn't just protect, it erases, leaving trails of broken lives in its wake, setting the stage for the central question of his enigmatic death. It is this leniency from 2008 that casts an unyielding shadow over every official account of his later fate, a thread that pulls at the seams of credibility itself. These controversies weren't isolated. They were the foundation of a life lived in the gray areas, where wealth insulated against scrutiny, and associations with the mighty obscured the cries of the exploited. As we peel back these layers, the atmosphere thickens with the weight of unanswered queries, the era's opulence contrasting sharply with the human cost buried beneath. Ultimately, Epstein's background reveals not just a man, but a symptom of systemic failures, priming the pump for the explosive events of July 2019, when the past finally caught up in a storm of arrests and suspicions. It was the kind of summer evening in New York where the humidity clings to your skin like a bad memory. And on July 6th, 2019, the wheels of justice finally caught up with Jeffrey Epstein at Teterboro Airport, just as his private jet touched down from Paris. Federal agents, their faces set in grim determination under the harsh glare of runway lights, swarmed the plane, They arrested him on charges of sex trafficking minors, handed down by prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. An indictment that echoed through the corridors of power like a long, suppressed thunderclap. The air smelled of jet fuel and impending rain, a fitting backdrop for a man whose empire of influence had spanned decades, now crumbling under the weight of accusations that refused to stay buried. Implications that suggested the system's leniency in 2008 had only emboldened the predator. Detained without bail, Epstein was shuttled to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, a fortress of concrete and steel rising amid the financial district's gleaming towers, where the sounds of the city, honking taxis and distant sirens, faded into the muffled hum of institutional despair. Awaiting trial, he was placed in the Special Housing Unit, the SHU, a segregated wing designed for high-risk inmates, where the isolation bites deeper than any cold wind off the Hudson. Here, in cells that reek of bleach and regret, prisoners endure confinement for about 23 hours a day, emerging only for brief showers or legal visits. The monotony broken by the clang of metal doors and the occasional shout echoing down the sterile halls. This setup, meant to protect or punish, instead fosters a pressure cooker of the mind, where thoughts spiral in the dim light filtering through narrow windows, hinting at how even a man like Epstein, accustomed to luxury, might unravel under such relentless scrutiny. Surveillance was the SHU's unblinking eye. Fixed cameras mounted in the corridors, and cells captured every movement, or so the protocols claimed, supplemented by routine checks from guards, whose footsteps provided the only rhythm in that otherwise timeless void. The staffing, a patchwork of overworked corrections officers, navigating budget cuts and union grievances, operated in an era when federal prisons were stretched thin, the air thick with the tension of potential oversights amid the cacophony of alarms and intercom static. These measures, layered like the city's smog, were intended to ensure no one slipped through the cracks, yet they whispered of vulnerabilities, where a high-profile detainee's fate could hinge on the vigilance of a system already fraying at the edges. In those early days of detention, turmoil simmered beneath the surface. Reports trickled out of Epstein's mounting anxiety, his legal team scrambling in wood-paneled offices overlooking the East River, while inside the MCC, the fluorescent lights buzzed like persistent doubts. The SHU's regime, with its 23-hour lockups, transformed time into an adversary, each solitary hour amplifying the echoes of past sins and future reckonings. A context that painted Epstein not as the untouchable financier, but as a man ensnared in his own web. Monitoring via cameras and checks formed a net of supposed security. Yet, in the understaffed shifts that plagued the facility, gaps emerged like shadows lengthening at dusk, implying that even the most watched prisoner could find moments of perilous invisibility. This is the oversight that mocks the promise of constant vigilance, a flaw in the machinery where human error and institutional neglect converge to erode the foundations of accountability. As weeks dragged on, the build-up to greater chaos was palpable. The air in the SHU grew heavier with unspoken fears, setting the stage for incidents that would challenge every official narrative. Epstein's arrest on that fateful July day reopened wounds from 2008, forcing a re-evaluation of how power insulates the guilty. And, in the MCC's bowels, the daily grind of detention began to chip away at the facade. Confined to his cell for nearly the entire day, under the gaze of those fixed lenses, he navigated a world reduced to echoes and solitude. A sensory deprivation that underscored the irony of a life once defined by excess, now stripped to bare essentials. The implications ran deep, suggesting that the federal system's handling of such a figure could either affirm justice or expose its frailties, especially as staffing shortages left routine checks vulnerable to lapses. Before the critical incidents unfolded, this environment brewed a storm. Guards patrolled corridors lit by flickering bulbs, their logs a testament to procedure. Yet the undercurrents of disarray hinted at impending cracks. And at the heart of it all lurks the central question: how could a man so closely monitored slip toward tragedy in a place built to prevent it? The SHU's cameras, static sentinels in their mounts, promised oversight amid the metallic tang of locked doors, but their feeds, reviewed in dimly lit control rooms, often revealed more about systemic blind spots than ironclad security. Early jail turmoil manifested in subtle ways, whispers of inmate unrest, the strain on overextended staff, all building like humidity before a downpour, implying that Epstein's detention was a powder keg awaiting a spark. As we trace these threads, the noir haze of New York's underbelly thickens, drawing us closer to the enigmas that would soon shatter the silence. In the shadowed underbelly of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, where the air hangs heavy with the metallic tang of desperation and the faint echo of distant shouts, we find ourselves drawn back to those stifling days of July 2019. Epstein's arrest had thrust him into the special housing unit, a place where isolation breeds its own kind of madness. And now, as the clock ticked into the early morning of July 23rd, something shattered the fragile veneer of routine. It was just before dawn on that fateful day, July 23rd, 2019, when guards discovered Jeffrey Epstein slumped in his cell, his neck marred by ugly purplish marks that spoke of violence. He was rushed to a nearby hospital for a brief stay, his condition serious enough to warrant immediate attention, yet shrouded in the kind of ambiguity that only deepens the intrigue. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead in those pre-dawn hours, casting long shadows across the concrete floors, slick with the residue of countless sleepless nights. While the inmates in adjacent cells stirred uneasily, their whispers cutting through the oppressive silence like knives. This was no ordinary morning in the SHU, where every creak and murmur carried the weight of unspoken threats. And what does this discovery imply in a system ostensibly designed to protect its most notorious charges? It peels back the layers of supposed security, revealing vulnerabilities that could turn a fortress into a house of cards, where one man's injury becomes a harbinger of systemic failures yet to unfold. Epstein, once revived and returned, confided to the staff that his cellmate had launched a brutal attack against him. These words, uttered in the sterile confines of an interrogation room, painted a picture of betrayal and raw aggression, transforming a shared cell into a potential crime scene. The atmosphere in that cell block was thick with tension, the kind that builds like storm clouds over a forgotten alley, where the scent of sweat and fear mingled with the distant clang of metal doors. Nicholas Tartaglione, Epstein's burly cellmate until that very day, loomed large in the narrative, a man whose own dark history added layers of menace to the unfolding drama. Such an accusation doesn't merely recount an event. It ignites a firestorm of doubt, suggesting that even in the heart of federal custody, alliances fracture and violence erupts unchecked, leaving us to question the very foundations of inmate safety and oversight. Yet, as investigators sifted through the accounts, they encountered a tangle of conflicting statements from other inmates. Some spoke of heated arguments echoing through the vents, while others claimed an eerie quiet had prevailed, their testimonies clashing like mismatched puzzle pieces in a dimly lit back room. The era was one of heightened scrutiny, with the world outside buzzing about Epstein's scandals, their clamor seeping into the prison walls through smuggled news clippings and hushed conversations. The SHU itself felt like a pressure cooker, its air stale and charged, where every glance between cellmates carried the potential for eruption. These discrepancies don't just muddle the timeline, they erode the credibility of the entire incident report, hinting at cover-ups or misremembrances that could mask anything from a genuine assault to a desperate bid for self-harm, disguised as something more sinister. Compounding the mystery, the OIG report later revealed a glaring absence. No recording exists of the incident, despite the array of cameras meant to capture every shadowed corner. This void in the footage stands as a silent accusation against the system, a blank tape where truth should have been etched in grainy detail. In the bowels of the facility, where the hum of surveillance equipment blended with the drip of leaking pipes and the occasional scuffle of boots on linoleum, that missing video feels like a deliberate omission, a gap in the narrative wide enough to swallow whole theories. What does this lack imply in the grand scheme? It transforms what might have been a straightforward altercation into a labyrinth of possibilities. Attempted homicide by Tartaglione, a suicidal gesture from Epstein himself, or perhaps a staged event to manipulate his circumstances, each thread pulling us deeper into uncertainty. Nicholas Tartaglione, removed from the cell that day, became a figure of intense speculation. His presence, until July 23, 2019, loomed over the event like a storm cloud. His alleged involvement, stirring whispers of motive and opportunity in the fog of conflicting tales. The sensory weight of that morning lingers. The metallic bite of blood, the hurried footsteps of responders, the sterile chill of the hospital room where Epstein was treated briefly. It was a scene straight out of a pulp novel, where heroes and villains blur in the half-light. And here lies the fracture that defies all attempts at a tidy resolution. A high-profile inmate injured under watch with no visual record to corroborate or contradict, leaving the door ajar for endless conjecture about what truly transpired in those hidden hours. This incident, with its blend of assault claims and suicidal undertones, hangs over Epstein's story like cigarette smoke in a dimly lit office. It raises the specter of foul play or self-inflicted despair, each possibility casting long shadows on the official account. The OIG report, that dry tome of bureaucratic reckoning, underscores the video's absence with clinical precision, yet it can't dispel the atmospheric dread that permeates the tale. In a place where eyes are supposed to be everywhere, blindness at such a critical juncture feels intentional. Ultimately, these elements conspire to imply a deeper rot, where security lapses invite chaos, and the line between victim and perpetrator dissolves in the murk. It's a puzzle that defies easy assembly, urging us to probe further. As we step away from this July 23rd Enigma, the questions linger like the aftertaste of cheap whiskey, setting the stage for what comes next. The critical equipment failure on July 29th, when a DVRA malfunction erased recordings from much of the SHU, coinciding with the mounting perils facing Epstein. In the shadowed underbelly of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, where the air hangs heavy with the metallic tang of regret and forgotten promises, we pick up the thread from that critical surveillance blackout that began on July 29th, a failure that turned the Special Housing Unit into a blind spot, ripe for exploitation. By July 30th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was shuffled back into the SHU, the echoes of his footsteps mingling with the distant clang of iron doors. This move came hot on the heels of the July 23rd incident, that bizarre episode in his cell that left questions dangling like cigarette smoke in a dimly lit room. The powers that be decreed he must have a cellmate, a reluctant companion in that cramped concrete box, ostensibly to keep an eye on him amid the flickering fluorescent lights and the perpetual hum of institutional despair. This wasn't just some bureaucratic whim. A prison psychologist had stepped in earlier, her notes crisp against the backdrop of chaotic inmate files, recommending double celling as a safeguard after the July 23rd scare, a measure meant to weave a thin net of human oversight in a place where isolation could swallow a man whole. In the stale, sweat-soaked atmosphere of the SHU, where days blurred into nights under the relentless gaze of indifferent guards, this recommendation carried the weight of professional caution, highlighting the fragility of a system that pretended to protect while often leaving its charges to the mercy of their own shadows. Yet as we delve deeper, the implication unfurls like a poorly kept secret. This push for companionship exposed the cracks in a facade of security, where one man's vulnerability became a mirror to the facility's own systemic frailties. Fast forward to the evening of August 9th, 2019, as the summer heat pressed against the barred windows and the distant wail of city sirens seeped through the walls. Epstein's cellmate was abruptly transferred out of the SHU, vanishing into the bureaucratic shuffle without so much as a whisper of replacement. The cell, once shared in uneasy silence, now stood empty save for Epstein himself, the air thicker with solitude amid the scuffed floors and graffiti-scarred walls that had witnessed countless untold miseries. This oversight wasn't merely careless, it shredded the very protocol designed to monitor high-risk inmates, leaving Epstein isolated in a void where the absence of eyes could invite the darkest impulses. A glaring lapse that begged questions about intent or sheer incompetence.
Later that same evening, as the clock ticked toward midnight and the SHU settled into its nocturnal hush, broken only by muffled coughs and restless pacing,
an MCC unit manager granted Epstein permission for an unmonitored phone call, a blatant violation of policy that hung in the air like forbidden fruit. The phone line, usually a lifeline under strict supervision, crackled to life in the dimly lit corridor, where the scent of institutional disinfectant mingled with the faint ozone of electrical wiring, allowing Epstein a moment of unchecked communication. Phone records would later reveal he dialed not his aging mother, as one might expect in a scripted tale of familial concern, but a female acquaintance, a connection that twisted the narrative further, underscoring how such lapses eroded the barriers meant to contain a man of his notoriety. These policy violations piled up like discarded case files in a cluttered detective's office, each one a testament to the creeping negligence that infested the MCC, where rules bent under the weight of indifference and oversight dissolved into the ether. In this labyrinth of concrete and steel, illuminated sporadically by harsh bulbs that cast long, accusatory shadows, the removal of the cellmate without replacement stood out as a pivot point, amplifying the risks in an environment already teetering on the edge of chaos. It's this solitary confinement by default that hollows out the Bureau of Prisons' claims of diligence. A void that echoes with the unspoken possibilities of what might unfold in unobserved hours. Coupled with the unmonitored core, these breaches painted a portrait of systemic rot, where the air grew thick with the implications of unchecked power and neglected duty, setting the stage for catastrophe in a place that should have been a fortress of accountability. As we reflect on these cascading failures, the central question looms like a storm cloud over the skyline. How could a facility tasked with holding the most infamous emerge so porous, allowing solitude and secrecy to conspire against its own mandates? The July 30th return to the SHU with a mandated cellmate born from the psychologist's prudent advice should have been a bulwark. Instead, by August 9th, it crumbled under the weight of transfers and violations, leaving Epstein adrift in a sea of institutional blind spots. In the gritty realism of this noir tale, where every detail drips with the cynicism of a world gone awry, these events didn't just heighten risks, they ignited them, fueling the fire that would consume the night ahead. The unmonitored call, that illicit lifeline to the outside, whispered of deeper complicities, its echoes reverberating through the halls long after the receiver clicked back into place. And so, as the evening of August 9th bled into the uncertain dawn, the SHU's vulnerabilities stood exposed, a testament to the human errors that no amount of policy could fully mend. This chapter in our investigation reveals not just lapses, but a pattern of negligence that smells of something more insidious, lingering in the air like the fog over a rain-slicked street. We've traced the custody shifts and the growing perils, from mandated companionship to solitary oversight, each step a misstep in the dance of detention. Next, we'll chronicle the chaotic overnight hours of August 9th into 10, where split shifts, skipped rounds, and falsified logs converged in a perfect storm, culminating in Epstein's untimely end. The clock ticked past 10:40 p.m. on that muggy August night in 2019, and in the dim, echoing corridors of the MCC's Special Housing Unit, the routine that was supposed to safeguard lives began to unravel like a poorly knotted rope. The two guards on duty, Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, were tasked with the simple yet critical job of performing 30-minute rounds and inmate counts. Their footsteps meant to echo through the cells as a reminder that no one was truly alone in the shadows. But that night, as the city outside hummed with distant traffic and the faint glow of streetlights filtered through barred windows, those rounds were skipped entirely, leaving the unit steeped in an unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional drip from a leaky pipe. This wasn't just a lapse in protocol. It was a void where vigilance should have been, allowing whatever darkness lurked in Jeffrey Epstein's mind to swell unchecked in the humid air of his isolated cell. As midnight approached, the logs that should have chronicled each check were instead filled with fabrications, entries claiming rounds at midnight, 3 a.m., and 5 a.m. that never happened, penned perhaps in haste under the flicker of fluorescent lights that buzzed like accusatory whispers. In an era where every action in a federal prison was supposed to be documented with ironclad precision, amid the scent of institutional cleaner and unwashed linens, these falsified records stood as a stark betrayal of the system's fragile trust. They implied a cover-up born of negligence, a paper trail that led nowhere, raising questions about what other oversights might have been scrubbed from the official narrative in the dead of night. Compounding the mystery, only a single DVR was operational that evening, its lens trained solely on the SHU's common area, capturing grainy footage of empty hallways where shadows danced like reluctant witnesses, but leaving Epstein's cell door frustratingly out of frame. The air in the control room must have felt thick with the hum of machinery, the era's reliance on digital eyes failing spectacularly in a place where every corner should have been under unblinking scrutiny. This blind spot in surveillance carved a gap in the timeline, suggesting that invisibility could be as deliberate as it was convenient, eroding the foundation of accountability in a system already cracked by prior lapses. From 10:40 p.m. until the early hours of August 10th, that footage revealed no one entering the tier, the common area remaining a desolate expanse of concrete and steel, undisturbed except for the distant clamor of the prison's nocturnal rhythms. In the stifling heat of a New York summer, with the faint metallic tang of rust in the air, this absence of movement painted a picture of isolation that bordered on the eerie, as if the unit had been sealed off from the world. It is this unbroken solitude that pierces the veil of coincidence, demanding we question how a man of Epstein's notoriety could slip so completely from oversight in those fateful hours. Then came the dawn, or what passed for it in the bowels of the MCC, when around 6:30 a.m., correctional officers finally approached Epstein's cell, the morning light struggling through grimy windows to illuminate a scene that would haunt the headlines. They found him unresponsive, hanged by a strip of cloth fashioned into a noose, his body limp against the cold bars, the air heavy with the unspoken weight of finality in a cell that reeked of desperation and decay. In the context of a facility plagued by understaffing and policy breaches, this discovery underscored a cascade of failures, where the removal of his cellmate days earlier left him vulnerable in the silence, amplifying the risks that policy violations had already compounded. The implication was clear. A system designed to protect had instead facilitated tragedy, turning routine neglect into a fatal oversight that echoed through the corridors like a muffled scream. Medical response was immediate, officers rushing in with the clatter of keys and urgent shouts, transporting him to the hospital where the sterile scent of antiseptics mixed with the urgency of beeping monitors. Yet, by 7:36 a.m., Jeffrey Epstein was pronounced dead, the official declaration cutting through the morning haze like a final, irrevocable verdict in a case that had only just begun to unfold. In an age of conspiracy and cover-up allegations, with the world outside awakening to the news amid the aroma of fresh coffee and morning papers, this pronouncement marked not an end, but the ignition of suspicions that would burn for years. It hinted at deeper machinations, where skipped rounds and falsified logs formed the threads of a web that ensnared truth itself, leaving us to ponder the shadows that lingered long after the body was removed. Building on the deteriorating custodial controls we'd examined, the transfer of Epstein's cellmate without replacement, the policy violations that stacked like kindling, this fatal night exposed the MCC as a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And as we turn our gaze to what followed, the initial investigations by the MCC and the Department of Justice will reveal early suspicions and official statements that only deepened the enigma. The morning after, as the city stirred under a haze of August heat and unanswered questions, The body of Jeffrey Epstein was wheeled into the sterile confines of the New York City office of Chief Medical Examiner's Laboratory. It was August 11th, 2019. And the autopsy would set the official tone for everything that followed. Chief Medical Examiner Barbara Sampson, a figure of unyielding precision in her white coat, amid the fluorescent glare and the faint metallic tang of dissection tools, oversaw the procedure that dissected not just flesh, but the very narrative of a man's end.
Her ruling came down like a gavel in a dimly lit courtroom. Suicide by hanging, the noose of bed sheets tightening the case closed.
Yet in the shadows of that verdict lurked implications that stretched far beyond the cold slab, suggesting a system eager to bury its secrets, along with the dead. Sampson defended her findings publicly, her voice steady against the rising tide of skepticism, insisting the evidence pointed unequivocally to self-inflicted despair. The air in press conferences thick with flashbulbs and doubt, where every word she uttered carried the weight of institutional finality. But this pronouncement didn't silence the whispers. Instead, it amplified them, revealing fractures in the story that mirrored those in Epstein's neck, hinting at truths too inconvenient for the light of day. Enter Michael Baden, the seasoned pathologist hired by Epstein's brother, his eyes sharp as scalpels under the scrutiny of a hired lens. He examined the remains in an era when conspiracy theories bloomed like weeds in cracked concrete, fueled by the digital underbelly of suspicion. Baden noted the broken hyoid bone and other neck fractures, stating they were more typical of homicidal strangulation than the drop of a suicidal leap. The room where he pored over photos smelled of old files and fresh controversy, a reminder of how forensics can twist like a ligature. Though he conceded such breaks could occur in hanging suicides, especially in older men, his words planted seeds of doubt that grew into towering implications, challenging the suicide narrative and inviting speculation about darker hands at play in the night. This particular pattern of breaks echoes the grip of violence rather than the fall of despair, a subtlety that pierces the veil of official certainty like a shadow in the fog. Meanwhile, the FBI descended upon the scene, agents in crisp suits, navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, their investigation unfolding in the stale air of federal offices, where coffee grew cold and leads evaporated. They sifted through evidence, interviewed the weary-eyed staff, and ultimately concluded there was no criminality in Epstein's death, a finding delivered in the crisp prose of official reports, amid a nation gripped by scandal and the relentless hum of 24-hour news cycles. Yet this absolution carried heavy implications, absolving individuals while indicting a system riddled with oversights, where negligence masqueraded as routine and the powerful slipped through the cracks like smoke. The initial administrative reviews at the MCC painted a picture of procedural lapses, guards dozing in the dim glow of monitors, rounds skipped like stones across a murky pond. Conducted in the immediate aftermath, these probes exposed the rot within, the air heavy with the scent of cover-ups and regret. They highlighted falsified logs and overlooked protocols, implications that rippled outward, eroding trust in the very institutions meant to uphold justice. Then came the indictments from federal prosecutors in Manhattan, charging MCC staffers Tova Noel and Michael Thomas with falsifying records and conspiracy. The courtroom echoed with the clack of handcuffs and the murmur of betrayal in a time when accountability felt like a rare commodity. These charges stemmed from the skipped rounds on that fateful night,
logs claiming vigilance where none existed. The implications were profound.
Suggesting not just oversight, but a deliberate veil drawn over the truth, leaving the public to ponder the depths of institutional failure. Noel and Thomas, faces etched with the weariness of the accused, stood as symbols of a broken chain of command, their actions, or inactions, illuminating the shadowy corners where responsibility dissolves into excuses. As the dust settled on these initial inquiries, the autopsy's suicide ruling, Baden's dissenting fractures, the FBI's clean bill, and the staff indictments formed a mosaic of contradiction. In the neon-lit streets of New York, where secrets fester like open wounds, this chapter closed with more questions than closures. The atmosphere was one of lingering unease, the era marked by erosion of faith in authority, each fact a thread in a tapestry that implied cover-up or colossal incompetence. Either way, a damning indictment of the system. We traced the night's deceptions, the blurred footage, the discovery at dawn. Now, with these probes laid bare, the stage is set for the broader reckoning, the DOJ's scrutiny, the OIG's deep dive, and the waves of backlash that would reshape the narrative. In the dim glow of a summer that felt heavier than most, on June 27th, 2023, the Department of Justice's Office of Inspector General dropped their comprehensive report, marked as 23085, into the laps of a waiting public. It was a thick dossier, pages echoing with the weight of institutional decay. Chronic failures within the Bureau of Prisons at MCC New York that had festered like untreated wounds in the underbelly of the federal system. The air in Washington hummed with the low buzz of printers churning out copies, while bureaucrats shuffled through fluorescent-lit corridors. The report laying bare how the Metropolitan Correctional Center had become a monument to neglect. Staffing shortages left halls echoing emptily, guards stretched thin as the shadows in those concrete tombs, and operational lapses that turned routine into recklessness. This wasn't just paperwork. It implied a deeper rot, a system where accountability dissolved like smoke in the humid night, allowing the very foundations of justice to crack under the pressure of indifference. Among the damning revelations, the report highlighted DVR failures that rendered surveillance as useless as a blind watchman. Cameras meant to capture every twitch and whisper in those cells malfunctioned or simply weren't monitored, their digital eyes glazing over in the critical hours. Amid the stale scent of institutional coffee and forgotten memos piling up on desks, it was the summer of reckoning, with the OIG's investigators poring over records in rooms thick with the dust of archived failures, uncovering how these technological breakdowns weren't anomalies but symptoms of a broader malaise, where maintenance logs read like fiction and oversight was a ghost in the machine. The implication cut deep. In a place designed to hold the powerful accountable, the watchers themselves had turned a blind eye, inviting shadows to dance unchecked and secrets to multiply in the dark. Staffing shortages compounded the chaos, with shifts undermanned and overtime logs bloated like overripe fruit. Guards patrolled, echoing tears where the clank of metal doors mingled with the distant hum of the city outside. But inside, the voids left by absent personnel created blind spots, vast as the night sky. This era of austerity in federal corrections, marked by budget cuts and burnout meant that protocols were bent until they broke. The report detailing how these gaps weren't just administrative oversights, but invitations to disaster, festering in the heat of a system strained beyond its limits. Here lay the bitter truth. When the guardians are ghosts, the inmates rule the asylum, and trust in the institution erodes like rust on iron bars. Falsified records emerged as another scar, logs doctored to show checks that never happened, penned in haste under the flicker of faulty lights. The OIG uncovered staff misconduct where signatures masqueraded as diligence, the ink still fresh on pages that lied about rounds made, and eyes that supposedly watched. In the post-Epstein haze of 2019, extending into the scrutinizing years of 2020 and 2021, these fabrications weren't mere errors, but deliberate deceptions, born from a culture where corners were cut in the dim-lit bowels of MCC, the atmosphere thick with the acrid tang of cover-ups and whispered excuses. The deeper meaning twisted like a knife. If the records themselves are fiction, then the entire narrative of security becomes a house of cards, ready to collapse under the slightest breath of truth. Legal and administrative consequences rained down on MCC personnel through those turbulent years, indictments piercing the veil like bullets in a back alley. Officers Tova Noel and Michael Thomas found themselves in the crosshairs, charged with falsifying records and neglecting their duties. Their names etched into court documents amid the clamor of flashing cameras and murmured pleas. The fallout unfolded in courtrooms heavy with the scent of polished wood and tension, where plea deals were struck and reassignments shuffled the deck. A period when the Bureau of Prisons grappled with its own demons under the unrelenting gaze of federal oversight. This reckoning implied a fragile justice. When the keepers of the law bend it for convenience, the line between protector and perpetrator blurs, leaving society to question the very pillars it relies upon. Yet, amid the catalogue of failures, the OIG report concluded there was no evidence contradicting the FBI's determination of no criminality in Epstein's death. It was a stark pronouncement, delivered in the sterile language of officialdom, against a backdrop of swirling rumors and midnight doubts. In that June of 2023, as the city sweltered and conspiracy theories bubbled like tar on hot pavement, the inspectors sifted through the debris of investigations, finding systemic neglect, but no smoking gun of foul play. The implication lingered like fog. Exoneration of intent doesn't heal the wounds of incompetence, and in the noir shadows of doubt, the absence of proof can feel like the cruelest deception of all. It is this cascade of documented lapses that undermines the fortress of federal assurance, leaving cracks wide enough for endless speculation to seep through. Proceedings against staff dragged on, with Noel and Thomas admitting to their lapses in plea agreements that spared them harsher fates. The courtroom air was thick with regret and the rustle of legal papers. As they confessed to browsing the internet instead of monitoring cells, their oversights captured in the cold light of evidence. This chapter of accountability, unfolding in the early 2020s, painted a picture of human frailty amid bureaucratic machinery, where distractions in the dead of night led to irreversible voids. Deeper still, it suggested that the true crime might not be murder, but the mundane betrayal of duty that allows tragedy to unfold unchecked. As the report's echoes faded, reassignments scattered personnel like leaves in an autumn gust, administrative slaps on the wrist masquerading as reform. The MCC's halls, still echoing with the ghosts of that August night, bore witness to a system patching itself with the thinnest of bandages. In the broader tapestry of justice's failures, this moment captured the era's cynicism, where headlines screamed reform, but the undercurrents pulled towards stagnation. Ultimately, the OIG's findings stood as a somber epitaph. Neglect had paved the path, but no hidden hands had pushed Epstein over the edge, leaving us to ponder the voids in a story that refuses to fully close. In the shadowed corridors of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, where the air hung heavy with a metallic tang of regret and routine, the guards assigned to Jeffrey Epstein's unit became unwilling stars in a tragedy that still echoes through the halls of justice. Tova Noel, a correctional officer in the Special Housing Unit, found herself at the center of an indictment for falsifying records, admitting in court that she and her colleague had skipped the crucial 3 a.m. count on that fateful night in August 2019. The dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead must have cast long shadows on the logbooks they doctored, a mundane betrayal amid the ceaseless hum of prison life. This lapse wasn't just oversight, but a crack in the system that allowed the unthinkable to unfold, raising questions about whether simple negligence could veil something far more deliberate in the web of Epstein's demise. Alongside her stood Michael Thomas, another MCC staffer indicted for the same deceit, his words hanging in the air like smoke from a forgotten cigarette when he confessed, "We messed up during those skipped rounds." The early morning hours, thick with the silence of sleeping inmates and the distant clang of metal doors, provided the backdrop for their shortcuts. Their admissions painted a picture of exhausted guardians in a crumbling fortress, yet the implications stretched further, suggesting that such messes might have been the perfect camouflage for forces eager to silence a man with too many secrets. Then there was Nicholas Tartaglione, Epstein's cellmate, from July 7th to 23, a hulking figure accused of attacking him in an incident that left bruises and whispers of foul play. The confined space of their shared cell, reeking of sweat and desperation in the sweltering New York summer, amplified every tension between the financier and the alleged quadruple murderer. Tartaglione's presence introduced a volatile element into Epstein's already precarious existence, implying that, even before the end, threats lurked not just from outside, but from the very shadows within his confinement. Beyond the prison walls, the FBI supervisory agents and DOJ prosecutors took the reins of the investigation, piecing together footage reconstructions in offices, buzzing with the low hum of computers and the sharp scent of fresh coffee. Their efforts unfolding against the backdrop of a nation demanding answers in the wake of Epstein's death. These unnamed officials navigated a maze of digital evidence and witness statements, but their work left lingering doubts, as if the reconstruction itself was a puzzle, missing key pieces that could rewrite the entire narrative. And, in the grand theater of congressional hearings, Ghislaine Maxwell invoked her Fifth Amendment right in February 2006. Her silence, a heavy curtain drawn over truths that might have illuminated the darkness. The chamber echoed with the rustle of papers and the murmur of spectators. A modern ritual in the ongoing saga of power and evasion. By refusing to testify, Maxwell fortified the veil of secrecy surrounding Epstein's network, implying that the full story remains buried under layers of legal protection and unspoken alliances. These players, guards, cellmate, Agents, prosecutors, and the elusive Maxwell form a constellation of motives and missteps, each one orbiting the central question. How did a high-profile inmate like Epstein slip through the cracks of a system designed to hold him? The indictments of Noel and Thomas for falsifying logs brought legal repercussions, including probation and community service, but no deeper probe into Epstein's death itself, leaving the air in those courtrooms thick with unresolved tension and the faint aroma of injustice. Tartaglione's brief stint as cellmate ended just weeks before the suicide, his alleged attack a prelude that hinted at vulnerabilities, yet investigators dismissed it as isolated. A decision that echoes with the implication of overlooked warnings in a facility rife with dangers. The FBI and prosecutors, with their reconstructions, promised transparency, but the absence of criminal charges for the death fueled skepticism, as if their reports were scripted to close doors rather than open them. Maxwell's Fifth Amendment plea in 22-6, amid the sterile glow of hearing room lights and the weight of public scrutiny, not only shielded her, but potentially obscured connections that could unravel the entire affair. It's this web of admissions and silences that cast doubt on the neat conclusions drawn by authorities. A network where every statement and omission pulls at the threads of truth. Consider the motivations. Noel's and Thomas's fatigue in an understaffed prison. Tartaglione's volatile temper in a high-stakes environment. The agent's drive for closure amid political pressure. And Maxwell's calculated reticence to protect her own skin. Each piece fits into a larger mosaic of systemic failure, yet together they suggest something more orchestrated, a symphony of errors too convenient to ignore. The legal fallout for the guards was swift but superficial, their pleas echoing in courtrooms where the real culprits, perhaps, remained unnamed and untouchable. Tartaglione's role, brief as it was, introduced physical peril that the system failed to mitigate, implying a deliberate blindness to threats in plain sight. And it's in Maxwell's refusal that the veil thickens most alarmingly, her silence a barrier that no subpoena could pierce, leaving the public to wonder what revelations died unspoken. These elements converge on that central question, probing the heart of the tragedy. Were these individuals mere pawns in a game of shadows, or active participants in obscuring the truth? This alignment of oversights and evasions erodes the foundation of the suicide ruling like acid on stone, demanding we look closer at what lies beneath. We've peeled back the layers on the key players, those shadowy figures orbiting Jeffrey Epstein's final days, their actions cloaked in a veil of secrecy that seems almost deliberate. But now, let's turn our gaze to the evidence itself, or rather, to the gaping holes where evidence should be. In the dim glow of hindsight, these inconsistencies flicker like faulty neon signs in a forgotten alley, promising answers, but delivering only more questions. The official narrative insists on transparency, yet the record is riddled with erasures and omissions that beg for scrutiny. Consider the surveillance footage, that elusive reel supposed to capture the truth of Epstein's last night. In 2024, the FBI destroyed its master copy after a prosecutor casually deemed it no longer pertinent, as if discarding a key piece of the puzzle could somehow complete the picture. The air in those federal offices must have hung heavy with the scent of bureaucracy and burnt coffee. Decisions made behind closed doors in Washington, where relevance is often a matter of convenience rather than justice. This destruction doesn't just erase data, it severs the chain of accountability, leaving investigators and the public alike grasping at reconstructions that may never fully restore what was lost, undermining any claim to unvarnished truth. Then, fast forward to 2025, when Congress finally reviewed a pieced-together version of that footage, only to uncover a 62-second gap, a so-called missing minute that vanishes right at the critical juncture, like a suspect slipping into the night shadows. The hearing rooms echoed with the low hum of projectors and murmured debates, the weight of national oversight pressing down amid the sterile chill of Capitol Hill, where every second of video was dissected under the harsh light of skepticism. Such a gap isn't mere technical glitch. It carves a void in the timeline that official explanations struggle to fill, suggesting either incompetence or something far more calculated. A silence that speaks volumes about what might have been concealed. Rewind to the heart of the matter, back in 2019, when chronic DVR failures plagued the Metropolitan Correctional Center, preventing half the cameras from recording starting on July 29th, just days before Epstein's death, leaving vast stretches of the facility blindly unmonitored. The prison corridors, dim and echoing with the distant clang of metal doors and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, carried an undercurrent of neglect, a system fraying at the edges in the humid New York summer. These failures don't align with routine maintenance logs. They erode the foundation of surveillance reliability, planting seeds of doubt that bloom into theories of sabotage or deliberate oversight, challenging the notion of an unpreventable tragedy. And then there are the unexplained video redactions scattered inconsistently across the footage that survived. Black bars obscuring faces and movements without clear rhyme or reason, as if an invisible hand were editing reality itself. In the review sessions, analysts hunched over screens in rooms thick with the smell of old paper and digital hum, piecing together fragments while redactions loomed like deliberate blind spots in a cityscape of evidence. These selective omissions twist the narrative, protecting identities or actions that could unravel the whole story, a pattern that whispers of protection rather than disclosure, fueling suspicions of a cover-up woven into the fabric of the case. Don't overlook the falsified staff logs, entries that contradict timestamps and accounts, painting a picture of diligence where chaos reigned, logs that were later admitted as altered or incomplete. The guard stations reeked of cigarette smoke and exhaustion, shifts blurring into one another under the relentless tick of institutional clocks, where paperwork became a shield against accountability. Such fabrications don't mend the breaks in protocol. They highlight a system willing to bend truths, eroding trust in every official statement, and leaving the central question dangling. Who benefits from these distortions? Finally, the absent witness testimonies, voices silenced or never summoned, guards, inmates, and associates whose accounts could illuminate the shadows yet remain shrouded in procedural fog. Interrogation rooms sat empty, the air stale with unspoken words and the faint echo of unanswered calls, as powerful figures evaded the spotlight in boardrooms far removed from the cell block grime. This void of testimony isn't oversight. It preserves a narrative unchallenged, allowing gaps to persist that no reconstruction can bridge, a discrepancy that claws at the heart of justice itself. Across millions of pages released by the DOJ, skewed and inconsistent redactions persist, veiling critical lines of inquiry like camera preservation, chain of custody lapses, and the identities of Epstein's powerful associates. The document dumps arrived in waves, each page heavy with ink and implication, sifted through in dimly lit archives where the rustle of paper mingled with the frustration of incomplete revelations. These redactions form a barrier not easily breached. They safeguard secrets that could shatter illusions of transparency, turning every official assurance into a question mark hanging in the humid air of doubt. At the core, the central question lingers. How do these contradictions square with a story of mere negligence? They don't. They form a mosaic of evasion that defies the clean lines of the official tale. As we sift through these fragments, the tension builds, each gap a thread pulling at the seams of credibility, leading us inexorably to the institution's own explanations, where suicide is framed not as mystery, but as inevitable failure. In the shadowed corridors of officialdom, where the truth often hides behind stacks of redacted files and bureaucratic smokescreens, we've just peeled back the layers of doubt that cling to Jeffrey Epstein's final hours, those evidentiary gaps and contradictions that have fueled endless speculation and conspiracy theories. But now, let's turn our gaze to the prevailing narrative, the one etched in government ink and stamped with institutional approval. Epstein's death was a suicide by hanging, enabled not by shadowy plots, but by a cascade of systemic failures within the very walls meant to contain him. The Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General laid it out in painstaking detail. They report a tome of neglect that reads like a noir novel's indictment of human frailty. In the dim glow of fluorescent lights flickering over the Metropolitan Correctional Center, operational breakdowns piled up like unfiled paperwork on a detective's desk. Take the surveillance system, that supposed unblinking eye watching over the inmates. According to the OIG, the DVR-2 recorder failed on July 29, 2019. A malfunction that went unnoticed until August 8th, days after Epstein's body was discovered. The air in those control rooms must have carried the stale scent of complacency, where technicians and guards shuffled through their shifts, oblivious to the digital blackout that left entire wings of the prison blind. This wasn't just a glitch in the machine. It meant that on the night Epstein died, there was no video record to confirm or contradict the events, a void that underscores how deep the institutional rot had seeped, allowing a high-profile inmate to slip through the cracks of oversight. Then, there's the matter of understaffing, a chronic ailment in the veins of the federal prison system, where shifts stretch thin like the patience of overworked guards. The OIG documented how the Special Housing Unit, Epstein's grim abode, was manned by skeleton crews, leading to falsified logs that claimed checks were made when, in reality, the halls echoed with absence. Officers like Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, later indicted for their roles, admitted to skipping inmate counts and rounds overnight. Their pens, scribbling lies into logbooks under the harsh buzz of institutional lighting. In that era of budget cuts and burnout, such negligence wasn't anomaly but symptom, revealing a system where accountability dissolved like smoke in the night air. The implication hits hard. These lapses didn't just happen. They created the perfect storm for tragedy, eroding the safeguards that might have prevented Epstein from taking his own life in solitude. Compounding this was the transfer of Epstein's cellmate, a decision that flew in the face of a psychologist's advice to keep him companioned after the July 23rd incident. An earlier brush with self-harm that should have raised every red flag in the book. The cell, with its cold metal bunks and the faint metallic tang of desperation, stood empty save for Epstein himself on that fateful night. In the summer heat of 2019, amid the clamor of New York City's underbelly, this oversight transformed a monitored space into a chamber of isolation, where vulnerability festered unchecked. It speaks to a broader failure, one where protocols were treated as suggestions, paving the way for inevitability. The FBI, delving into the aftermath with their forensic precision, concluded there was no criminality associated with Epstein's death, no evidence of foul play, just the grim mechanics of a man alone with his demons, their agents poring over evidence in rooms thick with the aroma of fresh coffee and old case files, pieced together a puzzle that pointed squarely at suicide. This finding, delivered in the crisp language of official reports, reinforces the narrative that negligence, not conspiracy, was the enabler here, stripping away layers of suspicion to reveal a core of institutional dysfunction. And let's not forget the New York City medical examiner's ruling, Dr. Barbara Sampson declaring the cause and manner of death as suicide by hanging. Her autopsy, conducted in the sterile chill of a morgue, where the air hangs heavy with finality. The examination, amid the clinical beeps and the faint antiseptic sting, aligned with the physical evidence, ligature marks, fractured hyoid bone, all consistent with self-inflicted asphyxiation. In an age where forensic science cuts through ambiguity like a scalpel, this conclusion stands as a pillar of the official story, implying that while questions linger, the science doesn't lie. Yet here's the rub that gnaws at the edges of certainty. These very details, meant to seal the case, instead highlight how perilously close the system came to outright collapse. It's a chronicle that defies the neatness of protocol, exposing fractures too wide to ignore. Multiple lines of evidence converge on this point. The skipped rounds, the broken cameras, the ignored recommendations, all threads in a tapestry of failure that the OIG and medical examiner have woven into a coherent, if damning, explanation. The atmosphere of that August night in 2019, with the city pulsing outside the prison's unyielding walls, must have felt like the calm before a storm that never fully broke. Guards dozed or distracted themselves. Logs were fabricated, and a man deemed at risk was left to his fate. The deeper meaning? It validates that no criminal act orchestrated Epstein's end, but it also condemns the system that allowed it, a negligence so profound it borders on the criminal itself. As we wrap this segment, remember that this official narrative, sturdy as it appears, stands on ground riddled with these institutional sinkholes. Next, the episode will pivot toward the alternate explanations and conspiracy theories that challenge and complicate the official conclusion, pulling us deeper into the shadows where doubt refuses to die. In the dim-lit corners of this sprawling saga, where shadows stretch longer than the truth itself, we've laid out the official line. A tragic suicide, born from a symphony of institutional blunders. Lapses in protocol that cascaded like dominoes in a forgotten warehouse. But now, as the city lights flicker outside my window, and the rain taps insistently on the glass, we turn to the whispers that refuse to fade. The alternate theories that bubble up from the underbelly of doubt and disillusionment. These aren't wild-eyed fantasies spun in smoke-filled basements. Their informed suspicions, fueled by a toxic brew of systemic rot and deliberate obscurity, challenging the narrative that Epstein's end was merely a product of negligence. Consider the surveillance footage, that elusive reel meant to capture the final moments in a cell block echoing with the distant clamor of guards' boots and muffled inmate murmurs. The fact stands stark. The FBI destroyed its master copy of this footage, erasing the original digital imprint that could have offered unfiltered clarity amid the humid air of a New York summer night in 2019. In an era where data hoarding is the norm, with servers humming endlessly in climate-controlled vaults, this destruction reeks of something more than oversight. It plants seeds of suspicion that the system itself might be complicit in burying inconvenient visuals, leaving the public to grapple with a void that echoes louder than any evidence. Then, there's the missing minute, that infamous gap in the reconstructed video, where the timeline warps into a 62-second abyss, pieced together from flawed backups that activists decry as a patchwork quilt of inconsistencies. Picture the control room, screens glowing faintly in the pre-dawn haze, as technicians supposedly rebuilt the feed. Yet this reconstruction, born from the ashes of the original, introduces a discrepancy that gnaws at the foundation of trust, suggesting not just error, but a deliberate sleight of hand to obscure what truly unfolded in those shadowed corridors. Public skepticism swells like a tide against these official shores, contrasting sharply with the DOJ's later release of heavily redacted materials. Pages blacked out in thick ink that smells of fresh printer toner and institutional caution. Multiple redacted names of powerful associates remain shrouded in the public corpus, hidden figures whose connections to Epstein linger like ghosts in the opulent halls of influence, from boardrooms thick with cigar smoke to private jets slicing through crisp night skies. This opacity isn't mere bureaucracy, it fuels theories of suppression, where the elite's web of complicity might extend to ensuring certain truths never see the light, perpetuating a cycle of doubt that erodes faith in the very institutions sworn to uphold justice. Ghislaine Maxwell's appearance before the House Oversight Committee in February 2026 adds another layer to this murky mosaic, as she sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Capitol hearing room, the air heavy with anticipation and the faint rustle of reporters' notebooks. She invoked her Fifth Amendment rights, refusing to testify on matters that could pierce the veil of Epstein's operations, her silence reverberating through the chamber like a withheld confession. In a time when transparency is demanded from every corner of social media's relentless feed, this refusal stokes flames of conspiracy, implying a deeper entanglement where key witnesses opt for shadows over revelation, leaving investigators and the public alike to question if her reticence protects more than just herself. Reports highlight falsified logs and suspicious timings of cell transfers, entries scribbled in haste on clipboards stained with coffee rings, in a facility where the night shift's exhaustion hangs palpably in the stale air. These anomalies, far from isolated errors, converge into a pattern that activists rally against, their protests echoing in rain-slicked streets outside federal buildings, calling for unredacted truths. It's this confluence that breeds informed suspicion, a sense that systemic dysfunction might mask intentional complicity, where negligence serves as a convenient cloak for darker machinations. And here's the fracture that splinters the facade beyond repair: the refusal to disclose those redacted names. A decision that defies the logic of accountability in an age of digital exposure. Activists point to the video reconstruction's flaws, the 62-second gap yawning like a wound in the timeline, reconstructed in sterile labs where the hum of computers drowns out ethical qualms. This isn't just a technical hiccup. It implies a narrative manipulated to fit, eroding the bedrock of public trust and inviting theories of conspiracy that thrive in the fertile soil of secrecy. At the heart of it all lurks the central question, whispered in dimly lit bars and shouted in online forums thick with anonymous fury. If it was truly suicide, why does every thread pulled reveal more knots than answers? These theories, born from the ashes of destroyed evidence and silenced testimonies, paint a picture of suppression intertwined with complicity, a conspiracy not of tinfoil hats, but of calculated opacity. As we sift through this fog, the rain outside my window picks up, mirroring the storm of doubt that refuses to abate, setting the stage for what comes next, the rippling aftermath, the professional reckonings and social scars left in Epstein's wake. In the dim afterglow of scandal, where the echoes of Epstein's death still reverberate through the corridors of power, we turn to the aftershocks, the fallout that reshaped careers and kindled endless debates. The Metropolitan Correctional Center, that concrete monolith in Lower Manhattan, became a graveyard for reputations. Staff members were swiftly reassigned, scattered like ashes in a November wind, while a few faced the cold hand of justice, pleading guilty, or slipping into deferred prosecution agreements that left a bitter taste of incomplete accountability. Amid the haze of bureaucratic reshuffling, where the air hung heavy with the scent of scapegoats and half-measures, these consequences whispered of a system eager to move on. Yet the implications lingered like smoke from a dying fire. Did these penalties truly atone for the lapses, or merely mask deeper systemic rot? From the polished podiums of the Department of Justice, leadership issued statements that rang with the hollow assurance of official prose, defending protocols and promising reforms in the crisp autumn of 2005, as if words alone could mend the fractures exposed by Epstein's demise. The atmosphere in those press rooms was thick with skepticism, reporters' notebooks scratching like claws on wood, capturing platitudes that floated in the stale air. And beneath it all, the implication gnawed that such declarations served more as shields than solutions, deflecting scrutiny from the powerful shadows they protected. Congress, that grand theater of oversight, stirred into action. In November 2025, they passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a legislative thunderclap demanding the DOJ release unclassified records, born from heated committee rooms where the ghosts of erased videos and broken testimonies still haunted the proceedings. The era was one of mounting distrust, with Capitol Hill echoing the public's weary demands amid the chill of winter hearings. This act implied a fragile hope for clarity, yet it underscored how mistrust had festered, turning oversight into a desperate bid to reclaim truth from the abyss. Come January 2026, the DOJ complied, unleashing millions of pages alongside thousands of videos and images, a digital deluge that crashed onto servers like a storm-swollen river, criticized for its chaotic organization that left researchers drowning in disarray. In the flickering glow of computer screens across newsrooms and advocacy offices, the atmosphere buzzed with frantic clicks and frustrated sighs, papers piling like fallen leaves. The deeper meaning here was a mockery of transparency, suggesting that volume could substitute for order, and chaos might bury inconvenient revelations. Legal and administrative proceedings against MCC staff dragged on, a slow grind through courtrooms thick with the musty scent of old files and whispered pleas, where justice moved at the pace of molasses, leaving victims to wonder if resolution would ever arrive. This drawn-out process, set against a backdrop of fading headlines and shifting public attention, implied a deliberate dilution of outrage, eroding the momentum for real change and allowing the powerful to slip back into the shadows unscathed. Public frustration boiled over, victim advocates marching in the sleet-slick streets, their voices roar against the wind, decrying the heavy redactions that blackened out names and details in the released corpus, turning promised transparency into a cruel tease. The air in those protest gatherings carried the sharp tang of injustice, banners whipping like accusations, and the implication cut deep that these inconsistencies fostered a cynicism which eroded faith in institutions, leaving society adrift in a sea of half-truths. Lawmakers, poring over the documents in lamplit offices, reported multiple redacted names persisting in the public releases, black bars concealing identities that whispered of untouchable elites, a veil that no act of Congress could fully lift. In the quiet hum of congressional archives, where dust motes danced in slanted light, this persistence implied a protective barrier for the powerful, raising questions about whose interests transparency truly served. Yet amid this torrent of partial disclosures, persistent unanswered questions clawed at the edges of certainty. The chain of custody for evidence remained murky, like fog over a midnight harbor, with gaps that invited speculation about tampering or loss. The atmosphere of inquiry was charged with the electric buzz of conspiracy forums and late-night debates. The implication here eroded the foundation of trust, suggesting that, without clear provenance, justice itself hung by a thread. Identities of implicated powerful individuals stayed shrouded, their outlines teasing from behind redactions, fueling rumors that swirled like cigarette smoke in dimly lit bars, where whispers named names too dangerous to print. In an era of digital leaks and anonymous drops, this secrecy implied a fortress around the elite, perpetuating a divide where the mighty evade the light that scorches the rest. And why was a public adjudication foreclosed by Epstein's death? That final barrier stands like a locked gate in the rain-swept night, denying closure and leaving victims' stories unfinished, their pain echoing without resolution. The context of his demise, shrouded in erased footage and silenced witnesses, amplified the implication that his end was not just convenient, but a deliberate snuffing of the torch that might have illuminated far darker corners. It is this veil of obscurity that pierces the heart of the official narrative, leaving wounds that no release of documents can heal. The central question remains unresolved, a specter haunting every file and testimony, demanding whether Epstein's empire of exploitation was truly dismantled, or if its tendrils still coil in the unseen depths of power. As we sift through the debris of these aftershocks, the mistrust sown by alternate theories lingers, a shadow that no amount of legislation can fully dispel.